General Flavius Silva lay flat on his back, watching a thin crescent of light appear above the middle of his tent and slowly gather intensity. Its very presence caused him to reflect unhappily upon the thickness of his head, and alternatively upon the house in Praeneste. By all the gods, it was the same frustration everywhere, whether you tried to accomplish something in that lovely rose-scented region, so convenient to Rome, or here in the wilderness of Judea. A new house or a siege, to have things properly done, required more than an order. You must see after whatever it was yourself, letters from architects notwithstanding. For a moment he reviewed the latest post from a correspondent he had decided was not only a scoundrel, but inept as well. Antonius Mamillianus, who presumed to call himself an architect. The letter. To Flavius Silva, General of the Legions, Procurator of Judea, from Antonius Mamillianus. Greeting. I am confident you would approve all the latest work done during the past month, though the cost has exceeded the original estimate by a considerable sum. Most of the excess is due to changes in plans made by your esteemed self. In particular, the addition of a bathing pool and the 6 statues which will grace the peristylum. The columns are of Etruscan marble, and the heads of obsidian, which I was fortunate to obtain. I tried very hard to persuade the great Sextus Cerilius to do the sculpting, but he is so much in demand these days, he could not promise delivery in less than 3 years. Consequently, I have split the work between Drusus Balbus, whose reputation may be known to you, and Calpurnius Phobatus, the Greek freedman from Syracuse, who has recently produced some interesting basalts. Both of these men are expensive, to say the least, the former demanding 60,000 sesterces, and the later 40,000, with an additional bonus of 10,000 if he delivers before the close of this year. You may obtain some satisfaction in the knowledge that when the flower boxes are in place, and the great arbor and shade trees are all flourishing, then the whole must certainly fulfill your original desires. When all is done, the villa should be a place of great tranquillity. Silva tried to remember that Vitruvius had written in his training of the architect something about practice and theory, something like those who rely only on theory were hunting shadow, not substance. Mamillianus would do well to reread his Vitruvius. There has been a great deal of unrest among the building trades recently. First, the plasterers refused to whitewash their own work, which required calling in a second group whose monetary demands were such that I myself was stunned. However, there was no individual workman who could even come near the villa until the matter was settled, so I could only surrender to their extortions and take comfort in the assurance that my principal value to you as a creative watchdog is to keep harmony among the laborers, and thus we may progress steadily. Then just last week the plumbers refused to install the ornamental bronze stopcocks without payment for the extra labor involved fitting to the present lead ducts, etc. The crescent of light now above was caused by some clod who had set the tent ropes too taut, therefore causing a breach between the cloth itself and the supporting pole, and thereby betraying Rosianus Geminus, who was not only captain of the Praetorian Guard, but was also responsible for details concerning his general's comfort. Ergo, Geminus would soon hear harsh words from his supreme commander on the subject of military perfection in the 10th Legion, and he in turn would pass his embarrassment on to the clod who had caused the crescent, via the end of his most eloquent whip, no doubt. And the clod would protest that it never rains in Judea, and so what was all the fuss about? A little gap in the general's tent, and he would be right, and he would still suffer the lash, because the Roman army was too small for the world. It must rule. It existed on discipline. Not only for the people it conquered, but for itself. The bleeding flesh of the clod would remind the entire camp that so small an oversight as a tent rope set incorrectly found punishment. Silva decided it was his own head that must be made of obsidian, and during the night someone had certainly sprinkled his eyes with cinders. He half rose on the couch to look down upon the woman beside him. She appeared to be sleeping. Doubtless, he thought, she is faking, as she has done with varied success during the more aroused moments of yet another night over-soaked in wine, and now lost forever. She had squirmed at the appropriate times, grunted and moaned as if by military drill numbers, but there had been no inner heat to her flesh or emission of her life juice during their writhings. She had submitted once more with sullen willingness, complying with every physical instruction, and had thus once more made a mockery of their union. He regretted the night. It was as if he had again lost a skirmish he should not have lost. A woman armed only with a skin of polished amber, he thought, has caused me to taste the bitterness of retreat, and is so careless of her victory, she dares make me wait upon her awakening, as if I were some poor courtier standing in attendance upon a queen. Watching her amused at his patience with her, he wondered how he could make absolute conquest of this female who was like an old and acid woman masquerading in a youthful body, a sorceress who had managed to cast her first spell from a distance and then close it upon him like a net. It was a unique relation, he thought, the result of some barbaric necromancy he could not recognize. Preposterous! Why should he trouble himself with this one female when he had only to clap his hands for a multitude? Yet a multitude of what? What relief was to be found in wrestling with the filthy local cows, those diseased camp followers of skin, grizzle, hair, and bone left over from the long campaign? They were hardly solace for the lowest legionary. During all this time in Judea, which had now been over 3 years, he had not before seen one woman he had considered worthy to receive his sperm. Have I been so long from Rome, he thought, that this girl-woman now beside me seems a prize? How if I am so stubborn and foolish as to keep her near me until she becomes habit, will she appear on the Capitoline Hill? How will she behave in the theatre of Marcellus, the shops about the Forum, or say strolling beneath Pompey's portico? If I take this country bumpkin to the games, will I introduce her to my friends to be laughed at? Will the dear, sweet, absolutely merciless ladies of Rome perceive her history at a glance? Regard the blind general, they might say. he who lost both his vision and his mind in Palestine, and so brought home a trophy he thought was a baboon. Another Jewess. Have you heard that on the sight of her every last one of his household gods jumped into the Tiber? Do you suppose she will one day insist poor addled Flavius Silva have himself circumcised? Ouch! What a spectacle, he mused. Apparently, I am just another stallion, thrusting myself at something I have told myself is or should be in heat. And the owner of the something looks so very tempting because she has no real competition. Am I so taken with her simply because she speaks Greek as if it were her native tongue, Hebrew so that it does not sound like a throat irritation, and Aramaic so that even I can comprehend it? Does she drop her final consonants in the latest vulgarian fashion? No, indeed. Not once have I caught her softening her W's or otherwise chewing on our national tongue. Then why? Do I snort and paw the ground in her presence simply because she is fearless or is such a clever meme she convinces me she is not afraid? How hungry must I be and lonely to find myself preening for her arrival and then posing with chin in hand like some eager youth, while I listen to her as if she had some immortal message to convey. And of all the manifestations doubled and redoubled in absurdity, I must play the game of seduction, actually cooperate in petty flirtation while we survey each other, and she so coldly measures the force of my desire. When the heat and pressure is sufficient, then we must toy with each other, experimenting and very cautiously exploring, as if she were the most innocent virgin. And then at last, when my eyes are dazed, and I have been reduced to a whinnying stud, then at last, depending upon the time of day, the weather, the consumption of wine, with our meal of assignation, coupled with what the soothsayer confided in her yesterday, when after an overture of laughter or tears, and testing the velocity and direction of the wind, whether it be north or south or east or west, matched against the existence of any possible noise, musical or otherwise, then and only then can we embark on one variety of fornication, unless at the very last moment she changes her mind. For which activity, he reminded himself, there is nothing worse than an indifferent partner. Now he was certain that she was feigning sleep, and he saw that she had even contrived to fix an appearance of contentment about her rather heavily featured face. She is too large of mouth, he told himself, as he had so many times before. On any other female, her mouth might be considered outrageous, yet her lips formed such a seductive frame they caught all attention. Her cheekbones and nose and brow were also molded with definite force, and still each was in such harmony with the neighboring feature the whole visage became a subtle masterpiece. Was it not blind man? After all, a true masterpiece dared not be perfect in all its parts. He suddenly remembered the first time he had noticed her eyes staring at him defiantly from an ocean of other eyes, mostly beseeching. That day, less than a month ago, he had left his interminable business in the wilderness and traveled with all speed to Jericho, where the garrison was reported to have mutinied. The report proved to be an exaggeration, although the troops were certainly out of control. And no wonder, since they were all auxiliaries, a mixed bag of Syrians, Numidians, Greeks, and Arabians, without a true Roman among them. The chief fault lay with their weak-spined commander, who called himself by the normality-honored Roman name of the Quadratus, although by birth the man was an Egyptian. The poor wretch had been so terrified of his troops he had allowed them to rampage as they willed simply because their pay had been delayed. Among other activities, they thought to solve their greed by rounding up all able-bodied inhabitants of Jericho and selling them off as slaves. Just who would buy during these days when the markets from Rome and Byzantium were glutted, they had not bothered to consider. It pleased Silva to recall that it had been taken only himself, 10 of his praetorians, and 40 mounted legionaries to bring that rebel to their senses. He had plunged into the turmoil, driven his finest chariot, the one presented to him after the fall of Jerusalem by Titus himself, a glorious vehicle with bronze heads of Medusa decorating the wheels and a golden satyr as the finial on the end of the draw-pole. Surrounded by his praetorians, wearing his finest cuirass, with the breastplate embossed with the 4 seasons, a bull, an eagle, and 2 standards against a sky background, he had driven through the rebellious troops as if they were beneath contempt. He had commanded them to release the Jews at once, and their answers had been shouts of derision. Then he had raised his right hand, signifying his Roman word was Roman bound, and assured them their pay was newly minted and en route from Rome, which was the truth, or he would not have given his right hand. It pleased him now to think that in his 37 years he had not once pledged his word to deceive. His predecessor, Lucilius Bassus, had been expert at the double tongue, but there was a different sort of procurator in Judea now, a true Corneli on his mother's side, hers being the last womb in the empire to produce bearers of that famous and most honored name. After some grumbling, all but a handful of auxiliaries released their captives, but one group of 100 or so hesitated too long. As their protest continued, Silva simply opened his left fist in their direction, and instantly his escort charged into their midst. 9 of the hesitants were run through and left to die in the street before the lessons in military protocol was thoroughly understood. When order had been restored, Silva had patiently explained to the survivors that looting, raping, and killing were to be done by order, Roman order, or not at all, and he had advised them to pass on his proclamation to their comrades. All Jews were now part of the empire's wealth, and as a consequence not able or available for casual distribution among those who depended for their very life upon that supreme authority. When he had first arrived in Jericho, several hundred of the more resourceful Jews had sought protection from the marauding auxiliaries in Quadratus's own courtyard. It was a pathetic refuge, had they really known the man, but at least they were spared the perils and indignities occurring in the streets. It was then that he had first found her eyes among so many others. Silva remembered how Quadratus had managed to host a reasonably decent meal on the upper terrace of his quarters, albeit the man was so distressed about his own safety he could hardly drink his wine. The quail had been tough and the olives mediocre, but there had been an excellent mullet fresh from the Sea of Galilee, and for a crack-lipped, dried-out desert soldier, that fish had been enough to make a feast of the occasion. Afterward, they had stepped to the parapet surrounding the terrace and looked down upon the Jews. They had been confined in the courtyard for 3 days, and of course were milling and fighting amongst themselves, as Jews always did when their hands were idle. It was astonishing how much mischief these people could get themselves into if they were not gainfully employed. It seemed to be one of their eternal curses not to know what was good for them. Quite by accident, Silva had noticed one group of Jews who remained a little apart from the others. They were quiet, and only the female among them looked up. After a moment he had realized that she was challenging him. He found himself wishing she would forsake her boldness and look away. But instead, she seemed to defy him in a way no other Jew had ever dared. Finally, it was he, Flavius Silva, master of Judea, who had broken off the staring. "Do you know that girl?" he had asked Quadratus. "Yes, she is of the family from Alexandria. I understand they were rather prosperous shippers, mostly grain to Rome." "Is that the father beside her?" "Yes, he seems reasonably intelligent for a Jew. Actually, the entire family affects an educated manner, which I find rather amusing." "What are they doing in Palestine?" "They claim they had merely planned a pilgrimage to Jerusalem and their temple, and to visit relatives. But of course Jews are incapable of purely exalted intentions or even simple affairs. One must always seek for their hidden motives. They also came to arrange for the export of wheat, oil, and balsam, because they are, or were, members of an association we in Egypt called the Naviculari. Who is the other man?" "He is the brother to the father and a native of Jericho. It was he who urged the relatives to come 3 years ago. Rather bad timing, wouldn't you say, General?" That pompous ass Quadratus had then laughed so uproariously all eyes both far away and near had turned upon him. Silva could still hear his laughter becoming thin and then ceasing altogether, when he had decided he had endured more than enough Egyptian snobbery. Why did that decayed race persist on behaving as if they were all descendants of Cleopatra? "You laugh too easily, Quadratus, which is perhaps the reason your troops are so unruly. I will solve your present troubles, but if they get out of hand again, I warn you that it will be your head on a pike." The girl could not possibly have heard the reprimand, yet she seemed pleased when Quadratus had nearly gone down on his knees. "I am deeply grateful, sire. You may be sure I shall find some way to enrich your life in return for mine." How such a craven goat could enrich anyone's life remained a mystery until more than a week had passed, and once more the desert seemed all of life and all there had ever been of life. Then a small caravan was reported approaching, Masada from the oasis of En-Gedi in the north. With typical Egyptian deviousness, and admittedly some imagination, Quadratus had attempted to repay his debt. He had sent the eyes to the wilderness, accompanied by her father, her uncle, his wife, 3 alleged cousins, as many servants, and an armed escort to assure their safe delivery. And with unmitigated impudence, he had revealed his modus operandi, having also sent a message of such flowering phrase and obvious scent, the long-dead Cleopatra must have wept in her tomb. Worse, an Egyptian had presumed the Roman form in his communication. To Flavius Silva, procurator of Judea, general commanding the 10th Legion, from Ptolemaeus Quadratus, military governor pro tem of Jericho, greeting. All those acquainted with your location inform me that it is one of the most desolate and uncomfortable places on earth. Thus do I even more admire your noble perseverance and utter dedication to the task at hand. In such a place I can only assume that even a Roman of your well-deserved power and resourcefulness cannot but lack for certain fundamental amenities of life, and for that want be troubled, which as I think of you robs me of what little sleep this minor command permits. The vision of Quadratus losing sleep over his commander-in-chief's discomfort was touching, but as nothing compared to his subsequent gesture, as he reviewed the heart of the message. Silva found himself smiling. Forgive me, distinguished general, if I presume to send you a present which may at first be difficult to open and may even try your patience. With your very great charm, I have a notion this gift may soon become more reasonable and afford you some hours of amusement and soothing relief from your arduous duties. Though my gift comes to you amply supplied with tents and all manner of goods, I apologize for the size, the truth being that the most important part resolutely refused to leave without the others. I would not, of course, be surprised, or if in the slightest offended, if you disposed of the excess at your pleasure. Inspiration for this gift came to me as I watched your face during the recent troubles here, and particularly when you stood on my parapet observing the courtyard. It is said that we Egyptians are possessed of a special sense which permits us to detect human affinities even at a distance. I shall make a sacrifice to Venus in the hope that in this case my senses were functioning at their peak and that my selection pleases you. May the great Vespasian rule as forever. Quadratus, you conniving bastard! While you should have been inspiring more discipline in your troops, you were scheming in your oriental fashion to cover your faults with a perfumed gift. Very well, Quadratus, you have indeed pleased me, though I refuse to become so lost in this strange creature as to forget your shortcomings. Yes, your gift was to the mark, for I have been yearning for some trifling of softness in this present environment. We are surrounded by rocks, each harder than the other, and the people we oppose are harder than the rocks, and that greatest rock of all, Masada, appears more formidable every day. Hence, as you hoped, Quadratus, I am disposed to smile upon your name, whether it falls from the lips of others or merely passes through my mind. And I do salute your acute perception, for you have chosen to my taste exactly. Were your choice any other, I must certainly have refused, but I am not at all certain I can ever refuse your propagandizing this girl and her family with tales of the fabled Bernice, and what she has done for herself, let alone what that extraordinary Jewess has done to Titus, and, so the gossip goes, to Vespasian himself. Oh, you have planned with the utmost cunning, my fine Quadratus, for if such a consummation were the result, if indeed this creature could drain my wits as well as my testicles, and make me another Titus, granting her every whim and favor, then where would you be, my good fellow? Directly under the sun. As her original sponsor, it would be quite natural for you to become her confidant, and as her confidant, become my secret sovereign, nicely positioned to maneuver all manner of affairs to suit yourself. And so, in time, there would be a new procurator for Judea, oddly enough, an Egyptian by birth and talents, one who calls himself Quadratus in the Roman fashion. As a dividend, you would have early revenge for whatever humiliation my presence in Jericho may have brought you. for you would have the exquisite pleasure of observing me trapped in the most ancient of snares, that unenviable bypass in which a man wonders if his woman serves him for himself or because of what he can do for her.